On a hot, silent afternoon, the still air inside a garage made the heat stick to the walls. A young mother walks in to grab a box, not noticing her baby crawling toward a dark corner. Amid piles of trash and paint cans, the baby stops in front of a German shepherd covered in thick blue paint. The dog's eyes are sealed shut, his chest heaving slowly. The baby touches his dirty snout. The dog trembles but gently licks the tiny fingers. The mother holds her breath. Outside, a black horse scrapes the ground restlessly near the fence. The mother reaches for her phone. And what happens next, no one is ready to see. Love stories with animals. Then hit subscribe now and never miss a moment. Thanks for being with us. Now, back to our story. The summer heat in Portland, Oregon was suffocating. Sarah Miller wiped sweat from her brow as she rummaged through the cluttered garage. Her 10-month-old son, Ethan, sat nearby on a blanket she had laid out, babbling happily to himself as he played with a plastic ring of colorful keys. The thick walls of the garage muffled the sounds from the street outside, creating a bubble of quiet that was broken only by Ethan's occasional giggles and the sound of Sarah moving boxes around. "It has to be here somewhere," Sarah muttered, pushing aside a stack of old magazines. She was looking for her toolbox, which contained the screwdriver she needed to fix Ethan's high chair. Being a single mother meant becoming a jack of all trades, and Sarah had become surprisingly handy over the past year. Distracted by her search, she didn't immediately notice when Ethan, having mastered the art of crawling with remarkable speed for his age, abandoned his toys and began making his way toward the darkest corner of the garage. It was only when she heard a strange sound, a labored breathing that wasn't coming from her son, that Sarah looked up. "Ethan!" she called, suddenly alert. Her eyes darted around until she spotted him, his small body silhouetted against the shadows as he approached something large and motionless. "Ethan, come back here!" But the baby continued his determined crawl forward. Sarah rushed over, and that's when the smell hit her, a powerful, nauseating mixture of paint and burnt plastic that made her stomach turn. The scent was so strong, it seemed to coat the inside of her nose and throat. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. There, in the corner of her garage, lay a German shepherd. The dog was completely covered in thick blue paint, its once proud coat transformed into a grotesque, sticky mask. Its eyes were tinged blue, barely visible through the mess, and its breathing came in ragged, desperate gasps. The animal's ribs expanded and contracted with obvious effort, each breath a struggle. Sarah's mind raced. How had the dog gotten in? The side door to the garage had been slightly ajar when she'd come in. She'd assumed it was from the wind, but now she realized the dog must have sought shelter here. But the paint, who would do such a thing? Her first instinct was to grab Ethan and run, to call animal control and let them handle this potentially dangerous situation. A large dog, injured and suffering, could be unpredictable. But before she could move, Ethan had already reached the animal. "No!" Sarah lunged forward, her heart in her throat. But what happened next made her freeze in her tracks. Instead of showing aggression, the German shepherd merely trembled as Ethan's small hand gently touched its muzzle. Then, with what seemed like tremendous effort, the dog's tongue emerged from its paint-encrusted mouth and weakly licked the baby's hand. Sarah stood transfixed, witnessing something she couldn't quite comprehend. The tenderness of the exchange between the suffering animal and her innocent child was profound. Despite its obvious pain and distress, the dog showed nothing but gentleness toward Ethan. The baby in turn showed no fear, only curiosity and what Sarah could only describe as compassion, if such a thing were possible in one so young. "Oh, you poor thing," Sarah whispered, her initial fear giving way to heartbreak. It was clear that this wasn't a random accident. Someone had deliberately covered this dog in automotive paint and abandoned it to suffer alone. The cruelty of the act made her throat tighten with anger and grief. Moving slowly, Sarah knelt beside Ethan and the dog. The animal's eyes, what she could see of them through the paint, watched her warily but without hostility. "It's okay," she said softly, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring the dog, Ethan, or herself. "We're going to help you." The dog made a small whimpering sound that pierced Sarah's heart. She couldn't leave this animal to suffer, regardless of how it had ended up in her garage. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone and called her neighbor Jason Thompson, who lived across the street. "Jason, I need your help. There's a dog in my garage and it's been hurt. Badly." Her voice cracked. "Can you come over and maybe bring some towels and water?" Within minutes, Jason arrived, his face registering shock when he saw the blue-painted German Shepherd. "Jesus," he breathed. "Who would do something like this?" "I don't know," Sarah said, keeping a protective arm around Ethan, who was still sitting close to the dog. "But we need to help it." Jason nodded, already wetting some of the towels he'd brought with the garden hose outside. "We need to get some of this paint off, especially around its eyes and nose. It's probably having trouble breathing." Together, they began the delicate process of cleaning the dog's face, working gently to avoid causing more distress. The dog remained remarkably still, as if understanding they were trying to help. Ethan watched with intense fascination, occasionally reaching out to touch the dog's ear or paw in a gesture that seemed oddly reassuring. "We should call a vet," Jason said after they'd managed to clear some of the paint from the dog's face. "This is way beyond what we can handle. That paint is toxic. The dog's probably suffering from chemical burns and inhalation." Sarah nodded, already searching for emergency veterinary services on her phone. Meanwhile, Ethan had scooted back to his blanket and returned with a piece of the crackers he'd been snacking on earlier. To Sarah's amazement, he crawled back to the dog and carefully placed the cracker near its mouth. The dog didn't eat it, it was probably too ill, but the gesture brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Even at his young age, Ethan seemed to understand that the creature was suffering and needed help. It was as if some primal instinct for compassion had awakened in her child, a connection that transcended species and language. As Sarah made calls, Jason continued to clean the dog as best he could. Word spread quickly through their tight-knit neighborhood, and soon other neighbors began to arrive, bringing supplies and offers of help. Mrs. Chen from next door brought a soft blanket. The Wilsons from down the street arrived with a can of dog food and a bowl of fresh water. Carlos from the house on the corner, who worked as a nurse, came to assess the dog's condition while they waited for professional help. Sarah watched in astonishment as her garage transformed into an impromptu rescue center. The community she'd always appreciated but never truly leaned on was rallying around this wounded animal with an outpouring of kindness that left her speechless. Throughout it all, Ethan remained close to the dog, sometimes babbling to it in his baby language, sometimes simply sitting in quiet companionship. The dog's eyes, now clearer since they'd removed much of the paint around them, followed the baby's movements with what Sarah could only describe as gratitude. The emergency. "Vet clinic can take him," Sarah announced after ending her call. "They have a volunteer program for cases like this, where the animal has clearly been abused." "I'll drive you," Jason offered immediately. "My SUV has plenty of space in the back." As they prepared to move the dog, carefully lifting it onto the blanket Mrs. Chen had brought, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on the strange series of events that had unfolded that afternoon. What had started as a simple search for a toolbox had turned into something much more significant, a rescue mission that had brought together neighbors who had previously only exchanged casual greetings, a test of compassion that had revealed the best in her community, and most surprisingly, a peculiar and touching bond between her baby son and this suffering animal. What Sarah didn't know then was that this was only the beginning. The blue German shepherd that had mysteriously appeared in her garage would come to change not only her life and Ethan's, but the lives of many others in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As they carefully loaded the dog into Jason's vehicle, with Ethan securely strapped into his car seat but still craning his neck to keep the dog in sight, Sarah had no way of knowing that their story was about to capture hearts far beyond their neighborhood in Portland. The journey that began in her quiet garage on that sweltering summer afternoon was about to take them places she never expected to go. The Portland Veterinary Emergency Clinic was a bustle of activity when Sarah, Ethan, and Jason arrived with the paint-covered German Shepherd. The staff's expressions shifted from professional courtesy to shocked concern as soon as they saw the blue-stained animal in the back of Jason's SUV. "Oh my goodness," breathed the receptionist, a young woman named Amber, who immediately called for assistance. "What happened to this poor creature?" Two veterinary technicians rushed out with a stretcher, their practice movements gentle but efficient as they transferred the dog from the vehicle. The German Shepherd whimpered softly but remained surprisingly calm, its eyes still rimmed with blue paint despite their cleaning efforts, searching until they found Ethan in his mother's arms. "We found him in my garage," Sarah explained as they followed the staff inside. "Someone covered him in what looks like automotive paint and abandoned him." Dr. Eleanor Reed, the veterinarian on duty, met them in the examination room. She was a woman in her early 40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that Sarah found immediately reassuring. "This is one of the worst cases of animal cruelty I've seen in a while," Dr. Reed said after her initial examination. Her voice was calm, but Sarah could hear the undercurrent of anger. "The paint is indeed automotive, high in toxins that can cause respiratory distress, chemical burns to the skin, and serious organ damage if ingested during grooming attempts." Sarah held Ethan closer, his small body warm against her chest. "Will he be okay?" Dr. Reed's expression softened slightly. "It's too early to say for certain, but German Shepherds are remarkably resilient. The fact that he's still conscious and responsive after what must have been hours of exposure is a good sign. We'll need to sedate him to safely remove the paint, treat the chemical burns, and assess for internal damage." As Dr. Reed spoke, Sarah noticed that Ethan was becoming increasingly fussy, straining in her arms and reaching toward the examination table where the dog lay. "I'm sorry," Sarah apologized, bouncing him gently to soothe him. "He seems to have formed some kind of attachment to the dog. It was strange. When we found him, Ethan crawled right up to him and the dog just let him. He even licked Ethan's hand." Dr. Reed raised her eyebrows. "That is unusual, especially for an animal in distress. Dogs in pain often become defensive or aggressive, particularly around strangers." "I know," Sarah agreed. "That's what made me realize I had to help him. The way he was with Ethan, it was like he knew we weren't going to hurt him." The veterinarian nodded thoughtfully, then made a surprising suggestion. "Would you mind bringing Ethan a little closer? I'd like to observe this interaction. Sometimes animals respond to children differently. It might give us insight into his temperament." Sarah hesitated only briefly before stepping forward with Ethan. As they approached, the dog's breathing seemed to steady, his eyes focusing on the baby. Ethan reached out a chubby hand, and Sarah carefully held him close enough that he could touch the dog's ear, one of the few areas relatively free of paint. The change in the dog was subtle but unmistakable. His rigid posture relaxed slightly, and a soft whine escaped his throat, not of pain, but something that sounded almost like greeting. "Well, I'll be," Dr. Reed murmured. He's responding positively to your son. This could actually help us during treatment. Animals under stress heal better when they feel safe and calm. The treatment process began immediately. While the veterinary team prepared to sedate the dog and begin the painstaking process of removing the toxic paint, Sarah settled in the waiting room with Ethan. Jason had to return home to his family, but promised to check in later. As the minutes stretched into hours, Sarah's phone buzzed with notifications. Jason had posted about the blue German Shepherd on the neighborhood social media group, and the response was overwhelming. Messages of support, offers of help, and donations toward the dog's medical care poured in. The story of the paint-covered dog and the baby who had befriended him was spreading through Portland like wildfire. A local news reporter called, asking if Sarah would be willing to share their story. At first, she was hesitant. She'd never sought attention and wasn't comfortable in the spotlight. But Dr. Reed pointed out that publicity might help identify the dog's original owner or, failing that, find him a loving home once he recovered. Plus, the veterinarian added, stories like this remind people that there's still goodness in the world. We could all use a little more of that. So, Sarah agreed to a brief interview, careful to emphasize the community's response rather than her own actions. She described how neighbors she barely knew had come together to help a suffering animal, how strangers were offering support, and, most touchingly, how her baby son seemed to have formed an instant connection with the injured dog. By evening, Dr. Reed emerged from the treatment area, looking tired but satisfied. We've removed about 70% of the paint, she reported. We had to shave much of his fur, unfortunately, but that will grow back. The good news is that his vital organs appear to be functioning well, though he's suffering from dehydration and some chemical burns on his skin. So he'll recover? Sarah asked, relief washing over her. With time and care, yes. We've inserted an IV to address the dehydration and administered medication for pain and to prevent infection. He's resting now. Dr. Reed paused, then added, we found a microchip. Sarah's heart leapt. So he has an owner. The information is outdated, Dr. Reed explained. We've reached out to the contact listed, but the phone number is disconnected. We'll keep trying, but... She let the sentence hang unfinished. Sarah understood the implication. It was possible the dog had been abandoned long before he was covered in paint and left in her garage. What happens to him now? She asked. He'll stay here for at least a few days. We need to monitor his breathing and continue treating the chemical burns. After that, if no owner comes forward, he'll likely go to a rescue organization that specializes in German Shepherds. Dr. Reed studied Sarah's face. Unless you're considering... Oh, I couldn't, Sarah said quickly, though something tugged at her heart as she said it. I'm a single mom with a demanding job, and my apartment barely has enough space for Ethan. And me, let alone a large dog. Dr. Reed nodded understandingly. Well, there's time to figure all that out. For now, you should go home and get some rest. You've had quite a day. But before they left, Sarah had one more request. Could Ethan say goodnight to him? I know it sounds silly, but... Not silly at all, Dr. Reed assured her, leading them back to the recovery area. The German Shepherd lay on a padded bed, connected to monitors and an IV drip. Much of his fur had been shaved away, revealing skin that was irritated and raw. In places, without the paint, Sarah could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, probably no more than 2 or 3 years old. Despite the sedation, his eyes opened when they approached, focusing immediately on Ethan. Hey there, buddy, Sarah said softly, holding Ethan where he could see the dog, but not touch him, mindful of the medical equipment. We came to say goodnight. You're going to be okay now. Ethan babbled excitedly, pointing at the dog and looking back at his mother as if to make sure she was seeing what he was seeing. He needs a name, Dr. Reed suggested, even temporary, for the charts. Sarah thought for a moment, looking at the traces of blue still visible on the dog's coat. How about Blue? At least until we know if he already has a name. Blue it is, Dr. Reed agreed, making a note on her clipboard. As they turned to leave, Blue made a small sound, a gentle whine that made Sarah and Ethan both look back. There was something in the dog's eyes that struck Sarah deeply, a kind of awareness and gratitude that seemed almost human. "We'll be back tomorrow," she promised, surprising herself with how much she meant it. The next morning, Sarah woke to discover that the story of Blue and Ethan had gone viral. The local news segment had been picked up by national outlets, and social media was buzzing with their story. The veterinary clinic called to report they'd received thousands of dollars in donations for Blue's care, as well as offers to adopt him from across the country. When Sarah and Ethan arrived at the clinic that afternoon, they found a small crowd of well-wishers had gathered outside, some bringing gifts for Blue, toys, blankets, even homemade dog treats for when he was well enough to eat them. Inside, Dr. Reed greeted them with a smile. "Your Blue is something of a celebrity," she said. "And he's doing remarkably well. His blood work shows the toxin levels are decreasing and his breathing has improved significantly." "He's not my Blue," Sarah corrected automatically, though the words felt strange on her tongue. Dr. Reed's smile turned knowing. "Come see him. He's been restless all morning. The nurses swear he's been waiting for you two." Sure enough, as soon as they entered the recovery room, Blue's tail thumped weakly against his bed. He was still connected to the IV, but he looked more alert, his eyes brighter and more focused. When he saw Ethan, he made a visible effort to lift his head. "Careful now," Dr. Reed cautioned as Sarah brought Ethan closer. "He's still weak, and those areas of exposed skin are tender." But Blue showed no signs of discomfort as Ethan reached out to gently pat his head, now mostly free of paint. Instead, the dog closed his eyes in what looked remarkably like contentment. For the next hour, Sarah sat beside Blue's bed with Ethan on her lap. She talked softly to the dog, telling him about their apartment, about Ethan's favorite toys, about the park near their home where dogs often played. She wasn't sure why she was sharing these details. Blue wasn't coming home with them after all. Yet something about his attentive gaze, the way he seemed to hang on her words, made the one-sided conversation feel natural. Ethan, for his part, was fascinated by Blue. He kept offering his toys to the dog, holding them out with a generosity that made Sarah's heart swell with pride. Blue, despite his weakened state, responded to each offering with gentle interest, carefully sniffing the plastic, keys, and soft stuffed animals without trying to take them. Dr. Reed observed this interaction with professional interest. "The bond they're forming is quite extraordinary," she noted. "In my experience, animals who've suffered abuse often develop fear or aggression toward humans. But Blue seems to have an innate trust, especially of your son." "Ethan has that effect. On everyone," Sarah said with a small laugh. "He's never met a stranger." But as she watched her son and the recovering German Shepherd, Sarah couldn't deny that there was something special happening between them, something that went beyond a child's natural curiosity or an animal's tolerance. It was as if they understood each other on a level that didn't require words, a connection that had formed instantly in that dark corner of her garage and was growing stronger with each passing hour. What Sarah didn't yet realize was how deeply this connection would affect not just Blue's recovery, but the course of many lives in the days to come. As Blue's story continued to spread, capturing hearts and inspiring acts of kindness throughout the community and beyond, the ripples of that first encounter between a paint-covered dog and an innocent baby were only beginning to expand. By the end of Blue's first week at the Portland Veterinary Emergency Clinic, his transformation was remarkable. The toxic paint had been completely removed, though patches of his fur remained thin where it had been shaved. The raw areas of his skin were healing well, and his breathing had returned to normal. Dr. Reed was pleased with his progress, attributing his rapid recovery not just to medical care, but to the daily visits from Sarah and Ethan. "He lights up when you two walk in," Dr. Reed observed one afternoon, as Blue lifted his head eagerly at the sound of Ethan's familiar babbling. From the hallway, his heart rate actually improves, and his stress markers decrease. It's quite fascinating from a medical perspective. What had begun as a simple rescue had evolved into something much larger. The story of the blue German shepherd and the baby who had formed an inexplicable bond with him had captivated Portland and beyond. A local filmmaker had approached Sarah about documenting Blue's recovery journey, and the veterinary clinic had started a dedicated social media page to share updates on his progress. With each new post, donations poured in, not just for Blue's care, but for a newly established fund to help other animals in similar situations. "You've started something important here," Dr. Reed told Sarah as they watched Ethan sitting beside Blue's bed, showing the dog a picture book as if reading to him. "We've received inquiries from schools asking if they can use Blue's story in their character education programs. A children's hospital has asked if Blue might be a candidate for therapy dog training once he's fully recovered." Sarah shook her head in wonder, all because he happened to find his way into my garage. "I don't think it was just chance," Dr. Reed said thoughtfully. Of all the garages in Portland, he found his way to the one with a baby who would approach him without fear, and a mother brave enough to help instead of calling animal control to take him away. The search for Blue's original owner had yielded nothing. The contact information associated with his microchip belonged to a family that had moved out of state years ago, and when finally reached by phone, they explained that they had given the dog, then called Max, to another family before their move. They had no records of who that family was. "So he's officially without an owner," Dr. Reed confirmed. "Which means he'll be eligible for adoption once he's medically cleared." The words hung in the air between them, an unspoken question that Sarah had been avoiding for days. She watched as Blue gently nuzzled Ethan's hand, his tail wagging slowly but steadily, a sign of his improving strength. "I wish I could take him," she said softly. "But my apartment doesn't allow pets over 30 pounds, and there's barely enough space for the two of us, as it is." Dr. Reed nodded understandingly. "There's no shortage of people wanting to adopt him, that's for certain. We've received applications from all over the country. The challenge will be finding the right match, someone who understands what he's been through and can provide the special care he might need." That evening, as Sarah prepared to leave with Ethan, she found herself lingering longer than usual. At Blue's side, the dog watched her with those intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through her, his head tilted in a question she couldn't answer. "We'll be back tomorrow," she promised, running her hand gently over his head. Blue leaned into her touch, a gesture that made her throat tighten with emotion. Outside the clinic, Sarah was surprised to find a small group of people waiting. They weren't reporters or curious onlookers, but ordinary citizens holding handmade signs with messages of support for Blue. An elderly woman stepped forward, introducing herself as Margaret Reynolds. "I've been following Blue's story from the beginning," Margaret said, her voice warm and slightly tremulous with age. "I lost my own dog 6 months ago, a Labrador named Charlie, who was my companion for 14 years. Your Blue has brought so much hope to people like me. I just wanted to thank you in person." Sarah was touched by the sincerity in Margaret's eyes. "He's not really my Blue," she explained. "I'm just helping him until he finds his forever home." Margaret smiled knowingly. "Sometimes the homes that animals find aren't the ones we expect." She reached out to touch Ethan's cheek gently. "Your son is a special little boy. The way he connected with Blue, that's a rare gift." The encounter with Margaret stayed with Sarah as she drove home. There was something about the older woman's words, about the look in her eyes, that resonated deeply. As she tucked Ethan into bed that night, Sarah found herself thinking about what it would be like to bring Blue home with them. To see him and Ethan grow up together, to have the loyal protection of a German shepherd, to witness that special bond continue to develop. But reality intruded on these daydreams. Her lease explicitly prohibited large dogs. Her job as a graphic designer already demanded long hours, and she relied on a neighbor to watch Ethan during the day. How could she possibly add the responsibility of a large, potentially traumatized dog to her already complicated life? The next morning, Sarah woke to an email from her landlord that made her heart skip a beat. The subject line read simply, "Regarding your petition for a service animal exception." Confused, Sarah opened the email to find that someone, she had no idea who, had submitted a formal request on her behalf, complete with documentation from Dr. Reed about Blue's potential as a therapy animal and the unique bond he had formed with Ethan. The landlord, moved by the story that had now become local legend, was willing to make an exception to the weight restriction, provided that Blue received proper training and certification. Sarah stared at the screen in disbelief. She hadn't submitted any petition. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to remove one of the major obstacles preventing her from adopting Blue. But who and why? Her phone rang. It was Dr. Reed, her voice unusually excited. "Sarah, I've just had the most extraordinary conversation with a woman named Margaret Reynolds. Do you know her?" "We met briefly outside the clinic yesterday," Sarah replied, still trying to process the email from her landlord. "She was with a group of supporters." "Well, she's just made an incredible offer. She owns a house in Laurelhurst with a large fenced yard. She's a retired nurse who lives alone since her husband passed away a few years ago. She's offered to adopt Blue." Sarah felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. "That's wonderful," she managed to say. "But that's not all, Dr. Reed continued. "She specifically wants this to be a shared arrangement. She knows how close Blue and Ethan have become, and she's proposing that you and Ethan visit regularly, as often as you like. She says her home would always be open to you both." Sarah sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the offer. "I don't understand. She doesn't even know us." "She says she knows enough," Dr. Reed replied, "and frankly, I think it could be an ideal situation. Margaret has the space and time that Blue needs, but he wouldn't lose his connection to you and Ethan. Would you be willing to meet with her to discuss it?" That afternoon, Margaret Reynolds met Sarah and Ethan at a cafe near the veterinary clinic. In person, Margaret was warm and grandmotherly, with silver hair styled in a neat bob and eyes that crinkled when she smiled. She immediately offered to hold Ethan, who went to her without hesitation, as if sensing her gentle nature. "I want to be clear," Margaret said, after they'd settled in with coffee for the adults and a juice box for Ethan. "I'm not trying to take Blue away from you. Quite the opposite. I believe he was meant to find his way to your garage, meant to connect with your son. But I also believe that sometimes we need help to fulfill the responsibilities that fate places in our path." She explained that she had been following Blue's story from the first news report. Having recently lost her beloved Labrador, she had been in a period of grief that left her feeling isolated and without purpose. Blue's story had touched something in her, a reminder of the healing power of the human-animal bond. "My home is too quiet now," Margaret admitted. "I have so much love to give, and no one to give it to. And when I saw the way Blue looks at your son, the way they seem to understand each other, She paused, her eyes misting slightly. I knew I wanted to be part of that story. Sarah was moved by Margaret's sincerity. But why the shared arrangement? Wouldn't it be simpler to just adopt him yourself? Margaret smiled. At my age, you learn that the simplest solution isn't always the best one. Blue needs a safe, spacious home where he can heal and be a dog. I can provide that, but he also needs the special connection he has with Ethan that can't be replaced. And you, my dear, need the freedom to build your career and raise your son without the added stress of caring for a dog with special needs. This way, everyone gets what they need. As they talked, Sarah learned more about Margaret. She had been a pediatric nurse for 40 years, working with children with special needs. She and her husband had never had children of their own, channeling their nurturing instincts instead into their careers and their dogs. After her husband's passing, she had continued to volunteer at the Children's Hospital until her own health. Arthritis that made standing for long periods painful forced her to cut back. I miss the children, Margaret confessed. Their resilience, their honesty. When I saw Ethan with Blue, it reminded me of the purest form of healing I witnessed in my career, the unconditional acceptance that children offer. By the time they parted ways, Sarah felt as if she'd known Margaret for years, rather than hours. There was something undeniably right about the arrangement she proposed, a solution that seemed tailored to benefit everyone involved, especially Blue. The next day, they arranged for Margaret to meet Blue at the clinic. Sarah watched nervously as the older woman approached the German Shepherd's bed, wondering how he would respond to a new person. She needn't have worried. Blue, who had grown increasingly alert and responsive during his recovery, regarded Margaret with calm interest, his tail offering a tentative wag as she extended her hand for him to sniff. "Hello, handsome," Margaret said softly. "I've heard so much about you." Blue's tail wagged more confidently, and he allowed Margaret to gently stroke his head. When Ethan toddled over to join them, Blue's attention immediately shifted to the baby, his entire demeanor brightening. Margaret watched this interaction with a tender smile. "See," she said to Sarah, "he knows. Animals have an instinct about these things. He understands that we're all going to be connected now." Dr. Reed, who had been observing from the doorway, stepped forward with a smile. "I think we've found our solution," she said. "Blue can be officially discharged next week. We'll need to discuss his ongoing care, the skin treatments, follow-up appointments, potential physical therapy. But medically, he's ready for a home." As the details were finalized over the following days, Sarah was struck by how seamlessly everything seemed to fall into place. Margaret's home was indeed perfect for a recovering dog. A single-story craftsman with a spacious, securely fenced yard shaded by mature trees. The neighborhood was quiet, but close enough to Sarah's apartment that visits would be easy. Margaret had even prepared a room specifically for when Ethan visited, complete with a toddler bed and age-appropriate toys. The media continued to follow Blue's story, documenting his discharge from the clinic and arrival at Margaret's home. The footage of Blue exploring his new yard, with Ethan toddling alongside him and the two women watching proudly from the porch, was broadcast nationally. Donations continued to pour into the fund established in Blue's name, which had now expanded. Its mission to rescue and rehabilitate abused animals throughout Oregon. What had begun as a horrifying discovery in a suburban garage had transformed into something beautiful, a network of care and compassion that extended far beyond a single dog and baby. As Blue settled into his new life, dividing his time between Margaret's nurturing presence and his special bond with Ethan, the ripples of their unlikely connection continued to spread, touching lives in ways that none of them could have anticipated. 3. Months after Blue's arrival at Margaret's home, the transformation was complete. The last traces of Blue had faded from his coat, which had grown back thick and glossy. His physical wounds had healed, leaving only a few small patches of lighter fur where the chemical burns had been most severe. But the most remarkable change was in his demeanor. The frightened, suffering animal that Sarah had found in her garage had blossomed into a confident, gentle companion who moved through his new life with grace and purpose. The unique arrangement between Sarah, Ethan, and Margaret had evolved into something none of them had expected, a kind of extended family built around their shared love for Blue. Sarah and Ethan visited Margaret's home 3 or 4 times a week. On weekends, they often stayed overnight in the guest room that Margaret had lovingly prepared for them. During the week, when Sarah was at work, Margaret sometimes brought Blue to visit Ethan at his daycare, where the dog had become a beloved visitor, patiently allowing the children to pet him and delighting them with simple tricks that Margaret had taught him. "He's a natural therapy dog," Margaret observed one Saturday afternoon as they watched Blue and Ethan playing in the backyard. The October air was crisp, the maple trees surrounding Margaret's property ablaze with autumn colors. "Look at how attuned he is to Ethan's emotions. When Ethan gets too excited, Blue calms his energy. When Ethan is quiet, Blue becomes more playful to engage him." It was true. The bond between the dog and the child had deepened in ways that sometimes left Sarah speechless. Blue seemed to anticipate Ethan's needs, moving protectively closer when they were in unfamiliar surroundings, gently herding him away from potential dangers in the yard, lying patiently beside him during nap times. "Dr. Reed called yesterday," Margaret said, passing Sarah a cup of tea. "She wants to know if we'd consider enrolling Blue in the therapy dog certification program. Apparently, the Children's Hospital is very interested in having him visit once he's certified." Sarah watched as Ethan threw a soft ball, which Blue dutifully retrieved and placed gently in the toddler's hands. "Do you think he's ready for that, after everything he's been through?" Margaret's expression was thoughtful. "I think his experiences have made him uniquely qualified. He understands suffering in a way most dogs don't. There's a gentleness in him that can't be taught." She smiled at Sarah. "Besides, it would only be for short visits at first, and I'd be with him the entire time." The therapy dog training began. The following week, Blue proved to be an exceptional student, quickly mastering the commands and behaviors required for certification. His natural calm around medical equipment, perhaps a result of his time at the veterinary clinic, was particularly valuable. By December, he had completed the program and made his first official visit to the Portland Children's Hospital, wearing a special vest that identified him as a therapy dog in training. Sarah accompanied Margaret and Blue on that first visit, watching with pride as the German Shepherd moved gently among the young patients, offering comfort without intrusiveness, seeming to know instinctively which children wanted to pet him and which preferred just to watch. One child in particular, a 7-year-old girl named Lily, who was recovering from extensive burns, formed an immediate connection with Blue. "He had burns too," Margaret explained to Lily, who was touching one of the light patches in Blue's fur, where his own injuries had healed. "See how well he got better. His fur grew back just like your skin will heal." Lily's eyes widened. "He was hurt like me?" "Yes, but look at him now. He's strong and happy." The girl studied Blue intently, then whispered something in his ear. Blue responded by gently licking her hand, causing Lily to giggle. The first time her nurses had heard her laugh since her accident. As they were leaving, one of the hospital administrators approached them. "I don't know what your dog said to Lily, but whatever it was, it worked. We've been trying to get her to engage with physical therapy for weeks, and she's been refusing. After you left, she told her nurse she wants to get strong like Blue. This was just the beginning. Blue's visits to the children's hospital became a regular occurrence, and his gentle presence seemed to have a remarkable effect on the young patients. Children who had been withdrawn began to open up, telling Blue their fears when they couldn't express them to adults. Those struggling with physical therapy found new motivation in the dog who had overcome his own injuries. The local media, which had continued to follow Blue's story, reported on his work at the hospital, interviewing doctors and parents about the impact he was having. The story was picked up by national outlets, and soon Blue became something of a celebrity in the world of animal-assisted therapy. Requests came in from other hospitals and rehabilitation centers, and Margaret carefully selected those where she felt Blue could make the most difference. Through it all, the special bond between Blue and Ethan remained at the heart of the story. Now approaching his second birthday, Ethan had developed a vocabulary that included several words specifically for Blue. Boo play meant he wanted to throw the ball. Boo sleep was his way of announcing that it was time for everyone to rest. And Boo home was how he referred to Margaret's house, which had indeed become a second home to him and Sarah. As Blue's public profile grew, so did the foundation established. In his name, what had begun as a fund for his medical care had expanded into the Blues Second Chance Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to rescuing and rehabilitating abused animals and training suitable candidates as therapy dogs. Sarah had volunteered her graphic design skills to create the foundation's branding and website, and Margaret served on its board of directors. They had already helped rescue and place 15 dogs and cats, 3 of which were now in training as therapy animals. One evening in early spring, as Sarah was preparing to leave Margaret's house after a weekend visit, her phone rang. It was Jason, her neighbor who had helped with Blue's initial rescue almost a year earlier. "Sarah, you're not going to believe this," he said, his voice tight with anger. "I just saw a post on the neighborhood forum. Someone found another dog, a mixed breed puppy this time, covered in the same kind of blue paint." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Where? When?" "About 5 miles from your place. Today. They took it to Guy, the emergency vet clinic, the same one where Blue was treated." Sarah exchanged a glance with Margaret, who had overheard the conversation. Without a word, Margaret nodded, already reaching for her car keys. "We're on our way," Sarah told Jason, then quickly called Dr. Reed to alert her that they were coming. The clinic, they found a scene eerily reminiscent of Blue's arrival nearly a year before. The puppy, a small brown and white mix that looked to be about 4 months old, was sedated on an examination table, its coat largely obscured by the same thick blue paint that had covered Blue. Dr. Reed was already working to clean it away. "From the puppy's eyes and nose, it's definitely the same type of paint," Dr. Reed confirmed grimly. "And given the similarities, I'd say it's likely the same person responsible." Sarah felt sick. The thought that someone was continuing to commit such acts of cruelty was unbearable. "Have the police been notified?" "Yes, but without witnesses or evidence." Dr. Reed let the sentence hang unfinished. They all knew how difficult it would be to identify the perpetrator. As they were speaking, the clinic door opened and a young couple rushed in, their faces etched with worry. "We're the ones who found the puppy," the woman explained breathlessly. "Is he going to be okay?" Dr. Reed assured them that the puppy's prognosis was good, especially since they had brought him in so quickly. As the couple explained how they had discovered the painted puppy huddled under a bush in a park, Sarah noticed Blue, who had accompanied them to the clinic, behaving strangely. The normally calm German Shepherd was alert and tense, his attention fixed on the clinic door. "What is it, boy?" Margaret asked, noticing his behavior as well. Blue whined softly, moving toward the door with purpose. Trusting his instincts, Margaret followed, with Sarah close behind. Outside in the parking lot, a man was hurriedly getting into a battered pickup truck. Nothing about him seemed particularly suspicious, but Blue's reaction was unmistakable. A low growl rumbled in his throat, the hair on his back standing slightly on end. The man, noticing them watching him, froze momentarily, his eyes widening as they fell on Blue. Then, without warning, he jumped into his truck and sped away, tires screeching on the asphalt. "Did you see that?" Sarah gasped. "He recognized Blue." Margaret was already taking out her phone. "I got his license plate," she said, quickly noting the number. "We should call the police." The next few hours were a blur of police reports and questions. The license plate Margaret had recorded led officers to identify the man as Tyler Brennan, a 34-year-old with a history of minor offenses but no previous charges of animal cruelty. When police visited his home, they found cans of the same automotive, paint used on both Blue and the puppy, as well as evidence that other animals had been kept there. Brennan was arrested and charged with animal cruelty. In the face of the evidence, he eventually confessed, revealing a disturbing pattern of behavior that had escalated over time. He claimed he had targeted strays or dogs that appeared to be abandoned, seeing his actions as a form of art rather than cruelty. The news of the arrest brought a complicated mix of emotions for Sarah and Margaret. There was relief that the person responsible had been caught, that no more animals would suffer at his hands. But there was also a renewed sense of horror at what Blue had endured, and gratitude for the extraordinary chain of events that had brought him into their lives. As spring turned to summer, the Z puppy, now named Indigo in a nod to his blue beginning, made a full recovery and was adopted by the young couple who had found him. Like Blue, he showed no lasting psychological trauma from his ordeal, adapting quickly to his new home and becoming a playful, affectionate companion. The arrest and subsequent media coverage brought renewed attention to Blue's story and the foundation named after him. Donations increased, allowing them to expand their work and partner with local law enforcement to establish a specialized unit dedicated to investigating cases of animal cruelty. Through it all, the core of their unusual family remained unchanged. Blue continued his therapy work, bringing comfort to children and adults in hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and nursing homes. Margaret's home remained a haven of peace and healing, not just for Blue, but for Sarah and Ethan as well. And Ethan, now a chatty toddler full of energy and curiosity, continued to share a special bond with the dog who had entered his life in such unusual circumstances. One warm evening in June, as they sat on Margaret's porch watching Blue and Ethan play in the twilight, Sarah found herself reflecting on the strange and wonderful journey that had begun with a desperate paint-covered dog in her garage. "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Ethan hadn't crawled over to Blue that day," she said softly. "If he hadn't touched him, if Blue hadn't responded the way he did, would I have called animal control instead of trying to help him myself? Would any of this have happened?" Margaret smiled, her eyes following Blue as he gently herded Ethan away from a bee hovering near a flower bed. "I believe some connections are meant to be," she said. "That baby and that dog were destined to find each other. The rest of us, we're just lucky enough to be part of their story." As the last light faded from the sky and the fireflies began to appear, illuminating the yard with their gentle glow, Sarah couldn't help but agree. In a world that often seemed chaotic and random, the bond between her son and this once broken dog felt like evidence of something greater at work, a reminder that even from the darkest beginnings, something beautiful could emerge. What she didn't yet know was that the most extraordinary chapter of their story was still to come, a chapter that would test their unusual family in unexpected ways and reveal the true depth of the connection between a boy and his dog. 2 years had passed since the day Sarah found Blue in her garage. Ethan was now 3.5, a lively preschooler with a vocabulary that impressed everyone who met him. Blue had become a certified therapy dog with hundreds of hospital visits to his credit. And Margaret, Sarah, Ethan and Blue had settled into a rhythm of life that felt as natural as if they had always been a family. The Blues' Second Chance Foundation had grown beyond anything they could have imagined. What began as a small local effort had expanded into a national organization, with chapters in 12 states, each dedicated to rescuing abused animals and training suitable candidates for therapy work. The foundation's success had allowed Sarah to leave her graphic design job and become its full-time director, working from a small office in Margaret's home. Their unconventional family arrangement had evolved as well. 6 months earlier, when Sarah's apartment lease had ended, Margaret had suggested that she and Ethan simply move in permanently. The spacious Craftsman house had more than enough room, and the arrangement made sense on every level. Sarah would have help with Ethan, Margaret would have the company she cherished, and Blue would have his 2 favorite humans under one roof. "We're already family in every way that matters," Margaret had pointed out. "Why maintain 2 households when we could share one?" So they had made it official. Sarah and Ethan moved into the upstairs of Margaret's home, which they renovated to create a private apartment-like space while still being part of the larger household. The arrangement proved ideal. Ethan thrived with the consistency and the constant presence of both his mother and the woman who had become like a grandmother to him. Blue, for his part, seemed happier than ever, dividing his nights between sleeping at the foot of Ethan's bed and keeping Margaret company in her downstairs bedroom. On a bright September morning, as they were preparing for a foundation fundraiser to be held that afternoon, Sarah received a phone call that would set in motion an unexpected chain of events. The call was from Dr. Reed, who had become a close friend and ardent supporter of their work. "Sarah, something unusual has happened," the veterinarian began. "A woman came into the clinic this morning with a German Shepherd puppy for vaccinations. She mentioned that she'd gotten the puppy from a breeder in Eastern Oregon who specializes in working lines. When I commented on the puppy's markings, which are quite distinctive, she showed me photos of the parents. Sarah, the father, looks exactly like Blue." Sarah sank into a chair, stunned. "That's impossible. Blue was a stray when I found him, and besides, he's..." She hesitated, uncomfortable with the word. "Neutered now, yes," Dr. Reed finished for her, "but he wasn't when you found him. The timing works out. This puppy is about 8 weeks old, which means it was conceived roughly 10 months ago. Blue had been with Margaret for several months by then, but before that, before the incident with the paint, he was unaccounted for." Sarah's mind raced. "Are you saying Blue might have escaped from a breeder? That he might have a history we know nothing about?" "It's possible. The breeder's name is James Wilson. He runs a small operation called Cascade Working Shepherds, about 3 hours from Portland. According to the woman, he had a promising young male that disappeared last year, jumped a fence during a thunderstorm, and was never found. He was devastated by the loss. Apparently, the dog had championship bloodlines and exceptional working ability." The news sent a ripple of excitement and anxiety through their household. Margaret, ever practical, suggested they contact the breeder directly. "If Blue is his dog, he deserves to know what happened, and we deserve to know where Blue came from, to have the full picture of his life." Sarah was more hesitant. What if he wants Blue back? Legally, if he can prove ownership? Margaret reached over to squeeze her hand. Let's not borrow trouble. From what Dr. Reed said, it's been well over a year, and Blue has a well-documented new life now. Let's just find out the truth, and then we'll deal with whatever comes next. The call to James Wilson was brief but emotional. The breeder was initially skeptical, but when Sarah described Blue's distinctive markings, including a small white patch on his chest in the shape of a diamond, his voice changed. "That sounds like my Storm," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He was the most promising dog I'd ever bred. Not just his conformation and working ability, but his temperament, extraordinary for a German Shepherd. He could read people in a way I've never seen before. They arranged to meet halfway between Portland and Wilson's property the following day. As they prepared for the journey, Sarah found herself torn between hope and fear. On one hand, discovering Blue's origins would complete the puzzle of his life, potentially explaining his exceptional intelligence and intuitive nature. On the other hand, she couldn't shake the fear that this revelation might somehow disrupt the perfect balance they had achieved. Ethan, picking up on her anxiety as children often do, climbed into her lap as she sat on the porch that evening, watching Blue patrol the perimeter of the yard as was his nightly habit. "Mama sad?" he asked, his small hand patting her cheek. "Not sad, sweetie, just thinking." "About Boo?" Sarah smiled, pulling him closer. "Yes, about Blue. We're going to meet someone tomorrow who might have known Blue before we did, before he came to our garage." Ethan considered this with the serious expression he often wore when processing new information. "Before the blue paint?" "Yes, before that." "When Boo was happy?" The question caught Sarah off guard. "I don't know, sweetie, I hope." "So," Ethan nodded confidently, "Boo happy now, with us." And the simplicity and certainty of his statement steadied her. Whatever they discovered tomorrow, the essential truth remained. Blue was happy with them, and they were a family. The meeting place was a small park just off the highway with a fenced dog area where Blue could safely interact with the breeder. As they pulled into the parking lot, Sarah spotted a man already waiting, tall and weathered, with the sturdy build of someone who worked outdoors. Beside him sat a German Shepherd that looked like a feminine version of Blue, watching their approach with alert interest. Blue, who had been dozing in the back seat, suddenly sat up, his attention fixed on the other dog. A small whine escaped. Him, not of distress, but what sounded almost like recognition. James Wilson approached slowly as they got out of the car, his eyes never leaving Blue. "My God," he whispered as Blue emerged, standing proudly beside Ethan. "It's him, it's Storm." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Wilson knelt down, his voice breaking as he called, "Storm, is that you, boy?" Blue looked at him, his head tilted, in that characteristic way that suggested he was processing something complex. Then, to Sarah's surprise, he walked forward, stopping just in front of Wilson. He sniffed the man's outstretched hand, and his tail began to wag, not the exuberant greeting he gave Sarah or Ethan or Margaret, but a clear sign of recognition. "He remembers me," Wilson said, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "After all this time, he remembers." The female shepherd approached cautiously, and Blue's demeanor changed instantly. His posture became more alert, his tail wagging more vigorously. The two dogs circled each other, sniffing with increasing excitement. "That's his mother," Wilson explained, watching the interaction with visible emotion. "Willow, she's the foundation of my breeding program. Storm was her first offspring to show the exceptional qualities I've been breeding for." Over the next hour, as they sat at a picnic table watching the dogs play, Wilson shared Storm's, now Blue's, history. He had been born on Wilson's ranch, the standout puppy in a litter of 6. From the beginning, he had shown extraordinary intelligence and a unique sensitivity to human emotions. Wilson had begun training him for both competitive obedience and search and rescue work, recognizing his potential to excel in both areas. The night he disappeared, we had the worst thunderstorm I've seen in 20 years, Wilson recalled. Storm had always been sensitive to thunder, not fearful, but restless. I put him in his run, which had never been a problem before, but somehow he managed to jump the 6-foot fence. By the time I realized he was gone, the storm had washed away any scent trail. I searched for weeks, put up flyers all over the county, called every shelter within 100 miles. He shook his head, still pained by the memory. I never imagined. He'd made it all the way to Portland. It's more than 150 miles. He must have been picked up by someone who brought him to the city, then escaped or was abandoned again. Sarah filled in the gaps, explaining how they had found Blue, Storm, covered in paint in her garage, how Ethan had approached him without fear, and how that moment had sparked everything that followed. She told him about Blue's recovery, his work as a therapy dog, and the foundation established in his name. As she spoke, Wilson listened with increasing amazement. "So he's famous," he said finally, a note of pride in his voice. "My Storm became a hero. He's changed so many lives," Margaret added, "not just ours, but all the children he visits, and the other animals the Foundation has helped rescue." Wilson nodded, watching as Blue gently herded Ethan away from a muddy patch near the fence. "I can see that, and I can see that he's found exactly where he belongs." The words hung in the air, carrying a weight that all of them felt. Sarah took a deep breath. "Mr. Wilson, I need to ask, are you going to want him back? Legally, if you can prove he was yours?" Wilson's expression softened. "I came here today not knowing what I would find. Part of me hoped it was Storm, because I've never stopped wondering what happened to him. But seeing him now, with your son, with you..." He shook his head. "He's not mine anymore. He's found his purpose, his family. I wouldn't dream of taking him away from that." Relief washed over Sarah, so intense that tears sprang to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "No, thank you," Wilson replied, "for saving him, for giving him the life he deserves. The only thing I ask is that maybe, if you're willing, I could see him occasionally. And perhaps," he hesitated, "perhaps consider breeding him just once. His bloodline is exceptional, and seeing how he's turned out, his work as a therapy, a dog, his temperament, those are qualities that should be preserved, passed on to future generations." The request surprised Sarah, but Margaret was already nodding thoughtfully. There would be details to work out, of course. Blue would remain with us, but a carefully planned breeding, it could be a way to extend his legacy, to create more dogs with his special qualities. The conversation continued as they walked back to their cars, making plans for Wilson to visit Portland, to see Blue in action at the Children's Hospital, to meet with the Foundation board, to discuss the possibility of a breeding program focused on therapy dogs. What had begun as a potentially tense confrontation had transformed into an unexpected collaboration. Another example of how Blue's presence in their lives seemed to create connections where none had existed before. As they drove home, Ethan fell asleep in his car seat, one hand still resting on Blue's head where the dog had positioned himself protectively beside the child. Sarah glanced at them in the rearview mirror, then at Margaret in the passenger seat. "Are you okay with all of this?" she asked softly. "The breeding idea, having Wilson involved in our lives?" Margaret smiled, the afternoon sun highlighting the silver in her hair. "I think it's perfect, actually. It completes the circle. Blue, or Storm, though I'll never think of him by that name, he came to us with his past erased, a blank slate. Now we know where he came from. The qualities that made him so special were there from the beginning. And the idea that there might be more dogs like him in the future, carrying on his work. Her voice trailed off, her eyes misting slightly. It's like we've been given a gift, Sarah agreed. The missing piece of his story. The fundraiser that evening was the most successful in the Foundation's history. Held in a downtown hotel ballroom, it attracted hundreds of supporters, including many of the children and families Blue had helped through his therapy work. The highlight of the event was the premiere of a documentary about Blue's journey, from his rescue to his work as a therapy dog. When the lights came up after the screening, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. As Sarah took the stage to thank everyone for their support, she found herself looking out at a sea of faces connected by a single, remarkable dog. Dr. Reed was there, along with the veterinary team that had saved Blue's life. Jason and the neighbors who had helped with the initial rescue sat at a table near the front. The young couple who had adopted Indigo, the second painted puppy, had brought their now fully recovered dog, who wore a vest identifying him as a therapy dog in training, following in Blue's paw prints. And in the back of the room, having arrived just in time for the documentary, stood James Wilson, watching with undisguised pride as the dog he had bred and raised, the dog he had thought lost forever, was celebrated as a hero. 2 years ago, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt. A series of terrible events led a painted, suffering dog to my garage. My son, not yet a year old, crawled to him without fear. What happened next can only be described as a miracle, not just of healing, but of connection. That connection has grown to include everyone in this room, and thousands more beyond these walls. She gestured to where Blue sat beside Ethan and Margaret at the front table, the German Shepherd's posture alert but relaxed, his intelligent eyes following her every move. Blue has taught us that even from the darkest circumstances, light can emerge, that suffering can be transformed into healing, not just for oneself, but for others, that the bonds we form with animals can change us in profound and lasting ways, and perhaps most importantly, that sometimes the purest wisdom comes from those we least expect, like a baby who sees not a frightening, injured animal, but a soul in need of compassion. As applause filled the room, Sarah caught Ethan's eye. He was beaming at her, one arm thrown around Blue's neck in a familiar gesture of affection. Beside them, Margaret watched with the serene smile that had become so dear to Sarah, the expression of a woman who had found an unexpected second chapter in life. In that moment, Sarah felt a sense of completion, of rightness. The journey that had begun in fear and uncertainty had led them to this place of joy and purpose. Blue, once a nameless victim of cruelty, had become the center of a community dedicated to healing, a symbol of resilience that inspired thousands. Later that night, as they returned home to Margaret's, to their house, the four of them moved through their familiar bedtime routine. Ethan had his bath, with Blue sitting patiently outside the bathroom door as always. Margaret read Ethan his bedtime story, while Sarah tidied the kitchen. And finally, as Ethan drifted off to sleep, Blue took his customary place at the foot of the boy's bed, his watchful presence a constant comfort. Standing in the doorway, watching them both, Sarah felt a wave of gratitude so intense it took her breath away. Their story, begun in pain and fear, transformed through compassion and connection, had come full circle. The dog with no name, no past, and no future had become Blue, the heart of their unlikely family and the inspiration for countless acts of kindness. Outside, the autumn night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky like promises. Inside, in the warm circle of light that encompassed a woman, a child, an elderly nurse, and a German shepherd with a remarkable history, there was only love, boundless, unexpected, and enduring. As Sarah closed Ethan's door partway, leaving, it opened just enough for Blue to come and go as he pleased. She whispered the words that had become a kind of prayer, a daily affirmation of the miracle they had been given. "Thank you for finding us, Blue. Thank you for choosing us." And somewhere in the quiet house, Margaret's voice seemed to answer, though she had already retired to her room. Or perhaps we found each other exactly when we needed to most. Either way, Sarah thought as she made her way to her own room, the truth remained the same. From the darkest beginning had come the most beautiful story, one that continued to unfold, touching more lives with each passing day, a testament to the healing power of compassion and the unexpected ways that love could transform even the most broken spirits into sources of light and hope. Dear listeners, we hope that Sarah, Ethan, and Blue's journey has touched your hearts as deeply as it has touched ours. This tale of compassion, healing, and unexpected connections reminds us that even in our darkest moments, hope can find its way into our lives in the most surprising forms. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories that celebrate the remarkable bonds between humans and animals. Find it by clicking the link to your left. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring unique stories that explore life's complexity and the extraordinary capacity for kindness that exists in ordinary people, and sometimes in extraordinary dogs. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know how Blue's story resonated with you. We can't wait to bring you our next heartwarming tale.